What happens when you reach the top of the mountain? When your ambitions are satisfied, when you are the great? In 62 BC, Pompey was on top of the world. His triumph was lavish, the greatest in Roman history, and well, he deserved it. He conquered the Eastern Mediterranean, the richest area of the Mediterranean Sea, meaning he was bringing home taxes that Rome had never seen, and now had clients, people working under him, that were kings, meaning entire kingdoms were his clients. Finally, having reached the position of king of the hill, Pompey looked around, and the top was under him, and all around was the fall. He was now in a defensive position for the rest of his life, and the rest of his life was going to be only 14 years. So as death sets the countdown, let's get into the second part of the life of Pompey and understand how and why the Great was pushed down from the top spot in Roman history by a man whose name became synonymous with power and success, Julius Caesar. When Pompey marched back to Rome, people were afraid. Of course, they were very happy about the new conquests, but many were suspicious they were going to see a new Sulla. He had the army, after all, an army completely loyal to him. 16,000 talents paid to these men. They were happy, fat, and waiting to receive more rewards for their sweat, blood, and tears. To conquer Rome and rule without opposition was going to be just a matter of marching, arriving, saying he was gonna do it, and well, do it. And yet, Pompey did not do it. We don't know if he regretted this choice later in life, but now that we have followed him for a while, we can understand why he did it. After all, a dictator was gonna be hated. The figure of Sulla was far from revered after his death, and Pompey, well, Pompey was the great, first among many, the best of the Republic. Why sully that legacy? So the triumph happened. It was actually in 61 BC on his birthday, and then right after, problems began to arise. Now, back in Rome as a politician, Pompey had a political objective, which was to distribute lands to his veterans, repay them in full. This, of course, wasn't just a generous action, it meant creating a solid base of approval for him, for his future in politics. Pompey's request was reasonable. After all, providing lands for veterans was a common practice in Roman politics. However, the Senate, led by conservative figures like Cato the Younger, vehemently opposed his proposals. Cato, a staunch defender of traditional republican values and an implacable opponent of anyone he perceived as a threat to the republic's stability, viewed Pompey's request with suspicion. Granting land to Pompey's veterans would not only elevate Pompey's influence, but also set a precedent for future generals seeking similar rewards. And of course, this land had to come from somewhere. It was an issue of control, even if others had done the same before, and you can understand the frustration of Pompey. After all, remember, he had just denied himself the sole ruling of Rome. He just refused the same power Sulla had wielded. And now, these people were refusing him basic concessions. Despite his military brilliance, Pompey was not a natural politician. His demeanor was often austere and aloof, especially after his great conquests and getting used to rule over kings and armies. He lacked the charisma and rhetorical skill needed to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics. His charisma was for the battlefield, for the soldier, and, let's admit it, it was also dulled. While he was charismatic when he was young, the more he won, the more, let's say, entitled he became. Building alliances became a struggle, and he was lost in the mud of Roman politics. Of course, the other problem Pompey had was his rivalry with Crassus. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, the hand behind everything, the man of influence and subtlety. Crassus had never forgiven Pompey for overshadowing his role in the suppression of Spartacus' slave revolt years earlier. Their mutual animosity led to a series of political maneuvers aimed at undermining each other. The two powerful men were effectively cancelling each other in politics. But how could Crassus confront Pompey on politics while Pompey was the Great? Well, the answer is quite simple. We'll go into details in our video about Crassus. Well, everyone owed money to Crassus, and you do not mess with the man you owe money to. In the middle of this was the Senate conservative faction, of which Cato was one of the leaders. These men theoretically held the idea that Rome had to go back to a truly pre-Sulla world, a world where personal ambition was second to the Republic. Now, let me say this. This was a fantasy. Cicero based a lot of his life on this fantasy, on this idea of a glorious previous republic where personal ambition was less important. But the truth is just that personal ambition was always the point of Roman politics. The only thing that was different now was that after someone actually used violence to win the battle for Rome, anyone could. And everyone was afraid that anyone could, meaning you had to put on a devastatingly powerful defense against these renowned generals like Pompey. And this only frustrated the renowned generals, making it more probable that they were gonna resort to violence. So this party was anything but a stabilizing factor. Now, the other main character of the conservative faction was a man named Cicero, the famed orator, statesman, and especially lawyer. Now, while Cato was unbendable, the man of steel of politics, Cicero, while wary of Pompey's growing power, was far more gentle in his dealings with the great. Sometimes an ally, sometimes an opponent. Now, what we have in front of us is total political deadlock. And in the middle of this political deadlock, there is opportunity for new figures to rise in order to break it. Charismatic, politically astute, young and ready was Julius Caesar. Caesar saw an opportunity to align himself not with one of the three great factions, but with two. Crassus and Pompey, the two men who rose to power under Sulla, had, therefore, a similar origin, meaning they could be brought back to be together again. In 60 BC, Caesar proposed to them the formation of an informal political alliance that would later become known as the First Triumvirate. Now, the First Triumvirate, the actual one, is the second one, because it's the first one that was actually known as a triumvirate during his reign. But since there was a triumvirate before, a three-way alliance, the name was applied, and so here we are. We will talk about the genius behind the strategic move of creating this alliance by Caesar in Caesar's video, but for Pompey, this was a win. Getting an alliance with Crassus meant he was gonna be able to push his little reforms, his land giving to the soldiers, everything was gonna be alright, he was gonna get everything he wanted. But of course, by becoming the chain link between the two great men, Caesar was aggrandizing himself, becoming actually the most powerful between them. Because nothing could actually happen without his word, without his presence, without his help. While we cannot say Caesar was nothing before this, he kinda was nothing. This was the moment in which he turned his life upside down and with one move was now playing with the big boys of the Republic. In order to strengthen this alliance, this triumvirate, personal bonds had to be established, especially between Caesar and Pompey, since Caesar and Crassus had actually a long-standing relationship going. Pompey married Caesar's daughter, Julia. This union, though politically motivated, reportedly blossomed into something we don't find that often in marriages in ancient times. It was a genuine and affectionate marriage. Pompey loved Julia deeply. And while you, of course, cannot account for that, Caesar couldn't have known Pompey was gonna fall in love with his wife, it brought stability to the triumvirate. Now let me pause a second and talk about this. It wasn't that normal to love your wife in ancient Rome if you were a powerful man. You had so many lovers, you went around doing anything you wanted, and, well, Pompey was made fun of for this. Imagine senators and powerful Romans joking around and laughing behind him, saying, "Oh, what is he gonna do? Go back to his wife tonight? We are gonna have a party." While funny, you can imagine that all of this had an effect on the Great. The Great was the odd man out. He felt more at ease on the battlefield than in Rome. He wasn't cut for this life, but he really deeply desired to be. He couldn't just be the Great in Asia Minor, where kings bowed down to him. He had to be the Great here, but he wasn't. Caesar was better than him at oratory, at engaging with politics. Cicero was a better orator than him. Crassus was incredibly capable of handling anything that went on in Rome. And Pompey struggled. Despite his difficulties in the political arena, Pompey harbored grand ambitions for Rome, and he expressed them using his wealth. One of his most enduring contributions was the construction of the Theatre of Pompey, Rome's first permanent stone theatre. The complex included gardens, a temple, and public meeting spaces, reflecting Pompey's desire to leave a lasting legacy as a benefactor of the Roman people. In 59 BC, Caesar rose to consulship and pushed through Pompey's land reform, giving his veterans what they desired. The Conservative Party was far from happy, and while Pompey was now winning politically, he felt like he was losing the admiration of those he desired it most, the great families of Rome. Pompey, after all, son of an equestrian, was not a patrician, was not one of them. But Caesar was. Caesar was from one of the most ancient and respected families in Rome. Even if, well, he had fallen to disgrace after Sulla's reign, as his family was connected to the Populares, the opponents of Sulla. Another position where the Senate battled with Pompey until he aligned himself with the Triumvirate was the reform of the East after his conquests. Now, on this too, we have to say that later historians lauded the complex network of alliances, provinces, the legal framework Pompey created in the East, and, well, they say that the stability created by this framework was the only reason why the eastern part of the empire held on during the civil wars. The only reason why the Roman Empire remained himself in this tumultuous time, survived, and endured. Caesar was made consul, as we said, in 59 BC with the help of Crassus and Pompey. Only 11 years to go. Tick-tock, says death. Right after his consulship, Caesar went on to his own great conquest, moving north to Gaul. As he was covering himself in glory and, well, having his own problems with the Senate, conservative faction that was trying to say his war was illegal, Crassus decided it was time for him to ascend to military godhood, to depart for the east and attack the Parthian Empire. Both of these wars we'll talk about in the videos about Caesar and Crassus, but for today, let's just say that Crassus went on to Parthia, was made fun of on the way by those who told him he was too old for this, and disappeared. He was slaughtered by the Parthians, and the Triumvirate was no more. But even before then, the key link between Caesar and Pompey was broken. Not by political action, but by fate itself. In 54 BC, Julia died of childbirth. Pompey lost the woman he loved and his major connection to Caesar. Of course, Caesar loved his daughter too. So these men are now mourning the same person, connected by pain and separated by their own agenda. With Crassus dead in 53 BC and the balance of power completely destroyed, it was now clear there was going to be a reckoning. 5 years, says death. Caesar, who was engaged in the campaigns in Gaul, watched from afar as Pompey assumed a more conservative stance day by day, aligning himself with the men whose respect he desired, the Senate. Caesar was now not the little guy he was before, he was the conqueror of Gaul. If Sulla was alive, he could have decided to call him the Great too. And this, of course, was unacceptable to Pompey. Plutarch and Suetonius both describe this period as one of mounting tensions, with letters exchanged between Caesar and Pompey revealing how trust was rapidly breaking. Caesar had a desire for a second consulship to protect himself from the Senate, and the Senate demanded that he disband his army and come back to Rome a private citizen. In 52 BC, chaos gripped Rome. The streets were plagued by violence between the gangs of Claudius and Milo, culminating in Claudius' murder. The Senate, desperate to restore order, appointed Pompey as sole consul, a highly irregular move that underscored his unmatched authority. Of course, Claudius was, at least in name, Caesar's man, and Milo was Pompey's man. So what truly happened was that Pompey's machination had managed to defeat Caesar's machination, and now Pompey was being called to solve the problem they themselves created. By 50 BC, tensions between Caesar and Pompey had reached a breaking point. The Senate, led by Cato and supported by Pompey, demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, just as before, but this time Pompey was truly behind it. Caesar refused, and everyone knew a war could break out at any moment. Pompey famously boasted that he could raise legions merely by stamping his foot, confident that his control over Italy was absolute. When Caesar in 49 BC said alea iacta est, the die is cast, and crossed the Rubicon. He didn't stamp because he knew there was nothing he could do to defend Rome. The civil war had begun and Pompey needed a more defensible position. He did not expect Caesar's swift advance, and while his forces were superior, they were located in the east, far away. Pompey, now the champion of the Senate, decided to evacuate Rome and bring with him everyone. The whole Senate, anyone that didn't support Caesar, went with him. Now let's remember, these are people who hate him, who have always hated him. He is outside of their circle, he is the great, but they say it ironically. To them, Pompey is a problem, and, momentarily, the solution to a bigger one. Cicero's correspondence reveals Pompey's internal struggle in these days. The great lawyer initially supported Pompey, but he expressed doubts about his leadership, criticizing his lack of decisive action. And yet, even Cicero recognized that Pompey truly was trying his best to preserve the Republic. With his strategic retreat completed, Pompey was now in Greece. He established a formidable base of operations, with the resources from the eastern provinces at his disposal and moving to him. Pompey amassed a vast army, but mostly comprised of fresh new troops and provincial allies. He did have both numerical advantage and a gigantic amount of cavalry. But Caesar had the Gallic legions, the men who just conquered modern-day France, the men who had fought every day for the last almost decade. Pompey looked at the map, looked at his men, the officers who did not trust his leadership, and immediately saw a solution. Defeat Caesar strategically and not tactically. Caesar was fast, but this made him rash, and Pompey was perfectly capable of using that against one of the greatest generals in human history. April 48 BC. 6 months on our countdown. After a difficult landing, Caesar finds himself fighting Pompey for the first time. They fight at Dyrrachium, a battle that will be known as the Battle of the Walls. Attempting to force a decisive engagement, Caesar tried to encircle Pompey's fortified position by constructing an elaborate series of walls and trenches. Both men were trying to outmaneuver the other by use of fortifications instead of armies. But as the game continued, Pompey noticed that Caesar's lines were stretched too thin. Switching from defense to offense, Pompey launched a massive assault, breaking through Caesar's fortifications and inflicting heavy casualties. Plutarch describes Pompey's victory at the Battle of the Walls as a moment of great elation. His soldiers, emboldened by their victory, urged him to pursue and annihilate Caesar's forces who were retreating. However, Pompey hesitated, concerned about the potential for an ambush and mindful of the need to maintain discipline. He chose to hold back. We will never know what would have happened if Pompey went after Caesar that day, but it is very possible he would have won. Sometimes this choice is represented as cowardice by Pompey, but in truth, the point was that Caesar had often proved himself shrewd, unpredictable, and capable of turning desperate situations around. Pompey was careful. His careful attitude had just won him the Battle of the Walls. One cannot ask him to be daring when being careful was working so well for him. After the Battle of the Walls, Pompey found himself in complete control of the situation. Caesar was in a perilous position. outnumbered, short on supply, and increasingly isolated in hostile territory. Pompey's plan, rooted in sound strategic principle, was clear. Avoid direct engagement, maintain the naval blockade, and let time and starvation defeat Caesar. Like a constrictor snake, he had Caesar trapped and could have achieved a bloodless victory. But that was the problem. Pompey was never good in the political theater, and he had brought politics with him. The Senate was physically there. Many of the noblemen who had fled Rome with Pompey were desperate for a swift and decisive victory. They, first of all, wanted to go back to Rome, to go back to their lives, to go back to their luxury. They didn't like living in a military camp. Men like Domitius Ahenobarbus called and clamored for an immediate battle. An enemy was to be defeated on the field in the most crushing and absolute way possible. That's what they thought. All of this strategic maneuvering was pathetic to them. Or, well, this is at least what they wanted us to think, what they wanted Pompey to think. After all, they wanted to go home, they wanted this to be over, they wanted Caesar to be defeated. And, well, Pompey was vulnerable to this. After all, how can the great be pathetic? After being pushed and pushed and pushed for days by people who had not even a quarter of his military reputation and experience, Pompey finally relented and agreed to face Caesar in open battle near Pharsalus. August, 2 months on our countdown. With 45,000 infantry and around 7,000 cavalry against the mere 22,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry on Caesar's side, Pompey's plan was simple and straightforward. With his cavalry on the left flank, commanded by the capable Titus Labienus, he was going to outflank the outnumbered enemy and destroy them. Caesar appeared confident, and well, that was never a good sign. Now, through Plutarch, we have access to the general speeches of that day at Pharsalus, but we should not put too much trust in it. After all, they seem to know the future, so it's probably Plutarch's way to make the battle more dramatic. But still, it's nice to look at them. Pompey reportedly remarked, "I go forth to meet the blow of fortune, but against my better judgment." He also addressed his soldiers as generals, as they choose this battle, not him. The manipulation by his political allies and his own yearning for glory led Pompey to abandon a position of overwhelming strength. And in the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar showed clearly why Pompey didn't want to engage him in direct confrontation. By hiding his heavy infantry in his own cavalry, he repelled Pompey's charge and managed to make the battle a straight-up confrontation where his veteran legions could do their job, what they did best. Despite Pompey's brilliance and experience, he was defeated at Pharsalus, the best strategist of his time, defeated by the best tactician. Accompanied by a small band of loyal followers, including his new wife Cornelia, Pompey sailed across the Mediterranean. He ran away from Caesar, even if he knew Caesar would probably forgive him. Caesar, after all, was forgiving everyone. But to Pompey, the idea of being forgiven, to walk back in Rome at the mercy and because of the mercy of his rival, the idea of being humiliated, was too much. Plutarch writes of Pompey's silence during the voyage in the Mediterranean Sea toward Egypt. His once proud demeanor diminished by the weight of his defeat. He avoided meeting the eyes of his companions, slowly realizing that his world had crumbled. Egypt, under young King Ptolemy XIII, was his last hope. Pompey had once intervened in Egyptian affairs, lending Roman support to the Ptolemaic dynasty. Surely the gratitude of the boy king would provide him sanctuary and maybe an alliance, maybe a way out of the hole he now found himself in. As Pompey's ship approached the Egyptian coast near Pelusium, envoys from Ptolemy's court met them. Pompey was assured sanctuary and embarked on a small boat to reach the coast from his ship. From here on, the story becomes dramatic. Cornelia, sensing danger, begged Pompey not to go, but Pompey, ever bound by his sense of dignity and perhaps clinging to the hope of restoring his fortune, insisted. It is unworthy of Pompey the Great to distrust friends. He sat down on the small boat, reading Greek to prepare to encounter people who were speaking Greek. And as he disembarked at the end of his brief journey, a Roman veteran now working for Ptolemy stabbed him repeatedly. Pompey fell into the shallow waters. He did not cry out, maintaining a stoic silence even in death, a grim echo of the dignity he had always sought to embody. He was the great, and the great does not cry. Plutarch recounts that Pompey covered his face with his toga as he fell, a final act of pride and modesty. His killers severed his head, intending to present it as a gruesome gift to Caesar. They, just as everyone else, had chosen their side, and the side they chose was the winning one. His body was left on the shore. Ptolemy would pay for this act of betrayal. When Caesar received Pompey's severed head, he reportedly wept. Despite being rivals, despite being enemies, Caesar recognized the magnitude of Pompey's fall. The man who had once stood as his equal, perhaps even his superior, had met a fate unworthy of his greatness. Caesar's wrath would surprise Ptolemy and leave him too facing a death unworthy of an Egyptian king. All of the figures in the civil wars are tragic. This is why it's a Shakespearean play. No one really wins. It will be for the following civil war to determine a true winner, Augustus. We'll see the tragic end of Caesar, of Crassus, of Cicero, of Cato, all of them. But for now, let's focus on Pompey. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter by those he admired and from who he wanted to be admired. He was sacrificed at the altar of the Republic. People who were afraid of his power, one wrong decision after the other. He was old, tired, and yet he won. Against all odds, he had managed to corner Julius Caesar. And then he opened his hand and let him go. He who conquered the East was swallowed by it, led to death by trusting someone who he considered a friend. And if you truly think about it, isn't this a reason for the empire? A good reason for the end of the Republic, because if Pompey the Great, the man who said no to absolute power, if he falls like this, if he cannot give land to his men, if he is unable to exist in the Republican framework without being hated, then who can? Maybe the Republic had to fall. Maybe Augustus avenged not only Caesar, but Pompey himself. What do you think about Pompey and his life? About his constant need for reassurance and love? Leave a comment. I'm genuinely interested in what everyone thinks. I hope these videos have helped you understand Pompey, and I hope we can understand Crassus next. Have a good one.